The difficulty I have with both of those approaches, and Becker's is the taste for discrimination approach.
In today's episode of Mixtape, the podcast, I have the pleasure of introducing a very interesting economist named William Darity, or Sandy Darity, as he often goes by. Dr. Darity is the Samuel DuBois Professor of Public Policy at Duke's Sanford School, and he's one of the more original economists I've had the pleasure of reading and talking to in a very long time. One of my favorite sayings is by the statistician George Box, who said, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." It reminds me that I should hold my beliefs with an open hand and not a clenched fist, and be willing to let things go when they stop being useful to me. Dr. Darity embodies to me some of that wisdom, if only for his willingness to consider that there may be alternative ways of doing economics that are just as useful, if not more so, than the ones we repeat to ourselves and to others. In this interview, we're going to discuss Dr. Darity's work he's done on stratification economics, the role that personal identification with groups play in inequality, reparations for slavery, growing up in the Middle East, and maybe one of the most controversial life choices that a person can make, working for Duke University as a lifelong obsessive fan of the Chapel Hill Tarheels basketball program. As always, I am your host, Scott Cunningham, and this is Mixtape, the podcast. Okay, so I have here with me Dr. Sandy Darity, goes by Sandy, the Samuel DuBois Professor of Public Policy at Duke's Sanford School. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. It's been a hard week for you, right? Because first Duke is in the Final Four with. Well,
no. I teach at Duke, but I am a Carolina fan to the bone.
That's what I thought.
So more or less, it's been actually a pretty good week, even if they lost in the final game.
They lost. Okay, so it was a bit of a roller coaster then. So they beat your employer and then lose at the end. Yeah, that's it's really nice.
But they have bragging rights for eternity.
Yeah, exactly. They say goodbye to Coach K and send him on his way. Well, so I wanted to just sort of start off and hear a little bit about your early life. So when we were talking just a minute ago, I had thought maybe you grew up in Virginia, but you told me that's not true. Just wanted to hear a little bit about your early life.
Yeah, and my early biography also explains why I'm a Carolina fan. But that's the story I'm glad to share. So I was born in Virginia, but when I was because my parents were living there, working there, although they both are originally from North Carolina. And both of my parents went to undergraduate school in North Carolina. My father went to Shaw University, and my mother went to Barber Scotia College in Concord, North Carolina. But they were working in Virginia at the point at which I was born, and so I really only lived in Virginia for maybe the first 6 months of my life. And after that, my father took a job with the World Health Organization, and so we moved to the Middle East. Wow. And so for the first 8 years of my life, we lived in Lebanon and then in Egypt. And my younger sister actually was born in Beirut, Lebanon. So, so there was not any kind of sustained period of time where I lived in Virginia. We came back to the United States when I was 8 years of age. And I entered fourth grade at Glenwood Elementary in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I was one of only 2 Black kids at the school. So effectively, the 2 of us desegregated the school. That's another story. But my father, we came back to the United States because my father had enrolled in a PhD program in public health at the University of North Carolina. And so that's why I'm a North Carolina basketball fan, because since the time I was 8 years of age, I was attached to that institution, because that's where my father did his PhD. So, yeah. So I've been a Carolina fan for 60 years.
Yeah.
So,
that's great.
And I couldn't reverse that when I took a job at Duke.
Yeah, they don't make you take like a pledge or something.
No, there's no blood oath, and so
that would have been like a deal breaker.
Yeah.
Well,
so much as much as I can say positive things about Duke, particularly with respect to some of the initiatives that I've wanted to pursue. I still can't bring myself to support Duke basketball.
Yeah, sure, I understand that. Do you have a lot of memories from Lebanon then? Is that something that's vivid at all?
I have more vivid memories, obviously, from living in Alexandria, Egypt, than I do in Lebanon. We were in Lebanon. Yeah. We were in Lebanon for the first 5 years of my life, and then in Egypt for the next 3. But I do have images and recollections, I'm convinced. Excuse me. I'm convinced that it's in Beirut where I first had a fish that they call it, but baronzino or something like that. It's some kind of Mediterranean sea bass. It's the best tasting fish of all, and I had some as a child, and I never had any fish that tasted like that again until I was in a restaurant and tried baronzino, and I said, "Oh, it must be the same fish," because it's fabulous. Yeah. I also have recollections of being driven up into the mountains around Beirut and seeing the trees that they call the cedars of Lebanon, and they were gorgeous. So I do have some recollections there. The negative recollection is the onset of the of a civil war in Lebanon, where my father arranged to get us out of the country and moved to Egypt before it was time for him to start his term of service there. So he stayed in Lebanon, and we were very, very concerned that he might not we might not see him again. But he managed to survive and joined us in Egypt, and so. So, maybe the most significant recollection I have from that phase of my life that's relevant to my work is living in Alexandria, Egypt, which is a coastal city, where the social system of stratification is evident as you go up the beachfront. Mm-hmm. So the beach is along what's called the Corniche. And at the far end of the beach is the palace that was the former home of King Farouk before he was ousted by a group of soldiers, military officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Before he was ousted, he lived in this really elaborate palace that's on the far end of the Corniche. And as you move from the lower end of the Corniche to the far end, the beachfront becomes more elegant. The beach is cleaner, it's less crowded. And so what I learned very early, because we had friends who were at all tiers of Egyptian society, what I learned very early was that the poorest Egyptians went to the beach, for the portion of the beach that was furthest from the palace. And as individuals became more affluent, they would migrate up the beach, so that the richest Egyptians were on the portions of the beach that were adjacent to the palace. And so you could actually look at the composition or the demography of the folks who were on the beach, and actually gauge their class position in Egyptian society. Now, I didn't have that language at that time,
right.
But I certainly did have a sense that folks at the low end of the beach were the poorest, and folks at the upper end of the beach were the richest.
Right.
And it began to really trigger questions in my mind about, well, why is this the case? Yeah. Why do some people have so much more than others, and why do others have so much less than the rest? And so, so that was kind of the beginning, I guess, in a way. That was the beginning of stratification economics for me.
Well, so when you were attracted to economics, were those the kinds of conversations that you heard in the history of the field were those kind of, what was it? What were the sorts of questions and debates that you were interacting with at the beginning that kind of drew you into economics?
So I was drawn into economics because I had an expectation that this would be the subject matter or one of the core subject matters of the field. I went to Brown University as an undergraduate, and at the time, in some sense, Brown's economics department was a bit of a knockoff from the University of Chicago, and so actually wasn't much attention given to these kinds of issues in a way that made sense to me.
When you say it's a knockoff, you mean sort of that the Becker
kind of the style of the department, the type of research people were doing was very similar, I think, in terms of it was very similar to the type of research that was emerging out of a University of Chicago. That's not to say that everybody was kind of a free market acolyte, but I think most of the faculty members were definitely, very much mainstream economists. And only one of them, Herschel Grossman, really had any kind of serious consideration of Keynesianism.
Right.
So, in that sense, I don't know, for want of a better term, it was a fairly orthodox economics department. Now there was a visiting professor who was British, who taught a class in urban economics that was fantastic and was closer to the spirit of the kinds of concerns that I had. And so I really, appreciated that, but that was unusual. And I became increasingly convinced that if you wanted to understand poverty and inequality, the conventional ways in which economists think about it are not particularly helpful.
What's the shortcoming of that, of the thing you're describing within economics that has held it back, or is it the frameworks, or is it the people that have held back the study of poverty and inequality within economics?
Well, it's the theoretical framework to a large degree, but it's also the fact that most of the people who join the economics field don't really challenge that theoretical framework. They accept it, pretty much. I mean, in the basic way in which economists explain why some people are rich and some are poor is by saying, well, you get a higher income if you have more human capital. Or if you have a better quality of human capital. And so these disparities are really due to deficiencies that the folks at the lower end of the distribution have. And that's a story that I think is really superficial.
So it seems like when I was kind of been preparing for the interview, I was thinking to myself, Dr. Darity has been in this I mean, I don't know exactly how to say this, but it seems like you've been in a conversation with Gary Becker for a long time. Is that accurate at all? Because even what you just said just then about human capital, and then also your stratification economics view of discrimination, it does not even seem to be built on that Beckerian framework. And so I guess it almost just seems like there's been a bit of a debate
Well, far be it for me to be presumptuous enough to say that I'm debating with a deceased Nobel laureate, but yeah, I mean, one of the earliest papers that I ever did, which was my senior honors thesis at Brown, which ultimately got published in the Review of Black Political Economy, was a critical examination of economic theories of discrimination.
Oh,
and a lot of the analysis there was devoted to thinking about the arguments that Becker had made, and I was attempting with, I don't know if I was successful or not, but
right.
I was quite critical of his approach.
So, the George Box quote, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I was curious, what do you think is useful about this traditional work that economists have done on discrimination, and what do you think is useless?
Well, I think that there's something that's of core use in traditional economics that extends into the work that I've tried to do in stratification economics, which is the importance of trying to think about whether or not the actions that people take have a rational basis.
Right.
Whether or not the actions that they take have an explanation that is consistent with saying that they are acting out of self-interest. And so that's a dimension of conventional economics that I fully embrace and carry into the work that I've tried to do in stratification economics. It's very conventional for people to say that low-income whites in the United States are voting against their own self-interest.
Right.
Well, in stratification economics, that's a proposition that doesn't make very much sense.
Right.
And so one of the things I've attempted to do is to explore ways in which you could say, well, no, in fact, whether or not you like the actions that they're taking, they are acting out of their sense of self-interest. And, it's paternalistic to say otherwise.
Yeah, sure. So where do you feel like the value of work like statistical discrimination or taste-based discrimination, what's the limits of where that is valuable in 2022 as like a policy? Or
well, the difficulty I have with both of those approaches, and Becker's is the taste for discrimination approach. I don't know, maybe Eigner and Kane were the major proponents of the statistical approach. But the problem I have with both of those approaches is that they do not demonstrate that discrimination can be a sustained process. Yeah. Whether you take the taste approach to discrimination or the statistical approach to discrimination, it's very difficult to make the claim that these are permanent or persistent states of affairs under competitive conditions in conventional economics. Yeah. And so that's part of the motivation for trying to rework the thing, to think about discrimination in a different context and to advance an approach to discrimination out of stratification economics, which could establish that, for better or worse, discrimination could be a stable state of affairs.
Yeah. Well, so can you sort of say, for people that are listening, how what is sort of the unique features of stratification economics?
Yeah, stratification economics arises in the work that I've done from thinking about one of the central findings from happiness studies. So, typically economists have said, well, you feel like you're better off if you have more of everything, or you have more of some things and no less of others. Okay. So it's your absolute position that dictates your degree of satisfaction or happiness. But the empirical happiness studies actually demonstrate that people don't necessarily feel better about having more of things. They feel better if they have more of things than other people.
Yeah.
So it's their relative position that matters.
Right.
And so that leads you on the path of thinking about what's the reference group or the peer group that people are comparing their own position against.
Yeah.
So the big step, though, in stratification economics is to say that one of the key peer groups is which racial or ethnic group or gender group you identify with. So what's your group affiliation? What's the affinity group for you?
Yeah.
And that's what influences not only your thinking about how well you personally are doing vis-a-vis other members of your group, but you also can be very concerned about how your group collectively is doing in contrast with others that are perceived as rivals or competitors. And so social group identity becomes a component of the assessment of your relative status.
So you have preferences over your own relative consumption, but you also have preferences over some average consumption of relative consumption of your
social group.
Identified group.
Yeah.
Interesting. So do you think that, so it's funny so this is actually took these out of the notes, the interview notes, because I didn't know we were going to go here, but I have such a complicated connection with that. It's like, as a scientific theory, I think it's really interesting, but like when I apply, I don't know how to apply any of this in a normative sense to my own personal life, because when I think about how much dissatisfaction or unhappiness that I feel sometimes when I compare myself to other people, it's profound. It's like, especially we've had health problems with one of our children, and you can look at other people that are happy, and it can be brutal and toxic even. And so like I'll go to sometimes I have trouble going to church now, because in the church that I've traditionally gone to, there's so much joyous expression, and our life has been really hard for 5 years. And so, but I think to myself, well, that I have got to get a handle on that, because that's harming me. And but then when I go into the literature and I read about, like utility having something to do with relative consumption and reference points, all I ever think is how much that has been destructive in my life to think that way. And I was just curious, like, how does all this fit together in one's own as a real world understanding of inequality in the world, and a kind of naivety that can come from not taking it seriously, but then also ways that it can get captured by a broken personal life, in a way that's not helpful.
So, I mean, that's really a powerful testament, actually, to the kinds of issues that are raised if you work through a stratification economics lens. My objective in thinking about these issues in this particular way is to try to provide an alternative explanation for inequality or stratification from the one that says, well, it's all due to a question of whether or not you have more or less human capital.
Right.
And so the whole issue of which social group you are affiliated with, whether by self-assignment or by external assignment, and that's an important distinction, influences what your position will be in the social order. And so this kind of group-based preference, particularly when it's exercised by individuals who are in the group that's in a dominant position, is extremely destructive. I mean, this is what produces the types of disparities that I think that most of us view as really, really disturbing and perhaps immoral. But it arises out of this type of preference scheme. And what's really important is the degree of intensity with which you identify with your social group. And this could be and from an aggressive standpoint, from the point of view of the group that is on top and wants to stay on top and may want to expand the distance between itself and other groups, versus the groups that are in a more bottom-tiered position, who may have very strong group attachments as a defensive mechanism against the circumstances that they're faced with.
Oh, interesting. Because it is an effective strategy. Is the group?
Well, I mean, particularly if your group is in danger from the police or the criminal justice system or terrorist attacks from the dominant group, it's important that you bond with the others in your group just for out of a sense of self-protection. Okay.
It's
so you know, it's you're in the group that's disadvantaged. It certainly is not economically useful for you necessarily to stay aligned with the group that's at the bottom. But it may be useful from the standpoint of sheer survival.
Right. Well, so that's what I was kind of wondering. So I was kind of thinking to myself, you know, like, as a white male, a young white male in the South in Texas, there's almost like some luxury I have in trying to entertain the possibility of not having a group identity, because I might not lose a lot. You know?
And I think many people who you know, would even self-describe themselves as being white don't really think about whiteness.
I don't at all. I was going to put that. I had that in the thing. I don't even know.
They don't think about it all the time. There has to be some circumstances that activate them thinking about it. Because it's normative from their perspective.
So but I guess, like, I still kind of think about things in this, like, you know, when you kind of go through, everybody responds to hardship in their life in different ways. And you know, I've responded with this kind of a particular type of spirituality. And so I've thought to myself, I've got to stop comparing myself to other people. You know, as we both kind of know, economics is just almost poisonous with professional, you know, one-upmanship type of, you know, Vita jealousy and things like that. And
like citation count.
Exactly. Just going on.
Did you place your article in a top 10 journal?
Exactly. That all that top 5 stuff is
and so it's interesting that economists don't pay that much attention to the importance of relative position.
Oh, I completely agree.
You know, there's like a research, even there.
Yeah, there's almost like a intrinsic, I've always kind of felt like I'm almost not surprised. There's almost like, you know, no guidance from the professional organization as to what values we should be sort of internalizing, because it's just this, like, you know, the free hand the invisible hand will guide all values in each of these departments, such that, you know, we've maximized some social function. And it's like the exact opposite in my experience of what has actually happened. But I guess I was just kind of wondering, what do you, when you think about, you know, when you think about the corrosiveness of this kind of interpersonal comparison, and if I heard you correctly, the necessity of it as a natural survival mechanism, what exactly is the good path for different types of people in their life as they kind of navigate an oppressive set of situations in their life, whether it's material or not.
Well, I think we cannot expect the groups that are at the bottom to dispense with their sense of identity before the groups that are at the top do so.
Right.
And so there is this whole question, if we think about stratification economics in the U.S. context and the context of U.S. race relations.
Right.
There is this whole question of, who among the white group will defect from whiteness.
Right.
And that's there's a paper of mine that's forthcoming in a special issue of the Journal of Economic Literature on stratification economics.
Oh,
and one of the issues that I try to examine is, are there conditions in which people will withdraw from a dominant social group, and what are the terms of withdrawal?
Yeah.
So there's stratification economics has lots and lots of potential applications.
Yeah.
But one of the areas in which I think it's most usefully applied is in thinking about questions of allegiance, identity, and political action.
Yeah. Allegiance. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So this is a large part of social history. Then you think about like religious movements and things like that. This stratification economics is almost a general theory of some kind of living in society. Is it also something to do with the competing over scarce resources a little bit? Is there something about people fighting for these groups are endogenous, and the psychological connection with the group is endogenous to the fact that there's just not enough to go around, or at least we don't believe there is?
Well, I think the last thing that you said is really the critical one, that we don't believe there is. So yeah, I think that the perception of scarcity is a factor that might lead in this direction. It's almost as if dominant social groups are mercantilist in terms of thinking that the world is one in which everything is a zero-sum game.
Right.
And so if another group has some form of advance or progress, it must mean that your group is losing ground.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, so I think that definitely comes into play. One of the other things that I talk about in the forthcoming paper is, very briefly, is the phenomenon of the last place aversion.
The last place aversion. Wow.
So even if you may have some receptiveness to a change in your relative position, you want to be sure you're not at the bottom.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. You don't want to be last.
Don't want to be last. No.
Yeah. That's like the opposite of that Schelling thing where nobody wants to be on the front row. So then the first 4 rows of any auditorium is completely empty.
Or empty.
So nobody wants to be on. But being in the last place is a little bit different, because you can only not be in the last place by fighting for the second to last place. So that was probably going to be a little bit more has potential for tension, for sure. Well, it's interesting because as you say all that, all I think about is that economics has a lot to offer because of our belief that various ways of working together can expand the possibilities. But it seems like in economics, the view is that this kind of happens naturally. Is that there doesn't need to be any worry that it won't just kind of work out. I always think about Stigler's, this is like a charitable way of putting it. Stigler's optimism about the historical processes is, like cannot be touched. Like if you're observing it, it is efficient. That's almost like what it's like a Stigler theorem. Like if I'm seeing it, it's a good. It had to be good, because if it wasn't, I wouldn't be seeing it.
It wouldn't be seeing it. Yeah.
But I mean, I was curious. What was your reaction when I say something like that? The fact that economics has that view of possibilities being expanded, but but kind of over maybe a tendency to believe it'll be kind of natural.
Well, I think one of the issues is what do we think is economics?
Right.
And to the extent that there are actually multiple traditions, even though those multiple traditions are not typically taught to our students,
right.
I think that there are other traditions that really are very open to thinking about much more creative ways in which our worlds could be shaped and organized. There's another paper of mine that I hope will appear in the Journal of Economic Education. I'm not sure if it will, but I hope it will. And it's based upon the association lecture I gave to the Southern Economic Association in January.
Mm.
And no, I'm sorry. I gave that lecture in November, November 2021. And I argue that the scarcity principle is actually a problem. That it's an obstacle to the ways in which we think about the world, and we don't have to use it as the cornerstone for economic analysis. And I propose two other cornerstones. One is uncertainty in Keynes's sense, and the other is inequality in the sense that Amartya Sen has explored it. And I was thinking you could easily build alternative approaches in economics from starting by saying that the core human condition is one of uncertainty, deep subjective uncertainty about the future, or by saying that the core economic condition is a long history of inequality. And then if you go from there, you begin to have a very different orientation in terms of the kinds of questions that you would be inclined to ask and the ideas that you might generate.
Has that been in your life kind of the emerging principles that you keep going back to, that have always been, you've sort of not been as drawn to scarcity being the starting point? You're right. I mean, in every definition of economics, you have that Lionel Robbins quote about
right.
economics is the study of scarcity. I mean, I use it too, because I always think to myself, well, we live on an earth with finite resources and we have to try to maximize the well-being of its inhabitants. But there's two components to the concept, though. One component is the available resources, but the second component is the degree of desire that we have for the products of those resources. And so you could conceive of a society where people had wants that fit within the boundaries of what's available. Right.
The premise behind scarcity is that wants are unlimited.
Yeah, that's right.
But that's a product of certain social conditions. It's a product of being in a society where advertising encourages you always to want more. Right. Being in a society where if you walk down the aisle in a grocery store, where cereals are being sold, that there's almost an infinity of varieties to choose from.
Right.
These are all scarcity is socially constructed.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, I guess we could imagine a world in which there were infinite resources, depending on the technology that we have access to. But I think it's more reasonable to think about scarcity as a social construct as a consequence of the fact that the notion that wants are unlimited. Is actually something that's very specific to particular types of
that's how I teach it too. It's interesting that you say that. I mean, in one sense, if you think of scarcity as finite material matter, right?
Yeah.
Then there's like, clearly it's not infinite, because there's a limit to the actual physical atoms or whatever. But it's clear economists don't.
Well, unless we have access to the mineral wealth on other planets.
And of course, right. It's
only wealth in terms of our own standards. Of the usefulness of these things.
Yeah. But it's clear, like, that you're right. Like when we do talk about scarcity, it immediately is followed with unlimited desires. And it's like unlimited desires is what literally makes something go from plenty to not enough.
Enough, yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
was thinking to myself, this is again, the I'm not Buddhist, but this Buddha says that the source of suffering isn't it desire or something like that? It's something like that. And I've always had a really difficult time with that teaching because I was an economist. I was so dyed in the wool, as being an economist, all I kept thinking was, well, utility maximization is a normative thing. It's not just positive. I think it's the best thing. I think we should be trying to maximize utility. It's just a matter of what those preferences are. But over time, I've been just thinking it has been really, whatever that means to have preferences over things, there is a version of it that has not been particularly helpful in my life. But I guess I wanted to just kind of throw this out there. When you talk to people in the classical liberal tradition, they'll kind of present, now none of this is like, not all of this is like carefully well identified causal effects. So it's more like a part of a narrative that's become very popular, which is like, well, the profit motive, though, has caused an incredible change in the standards of living historically. We've got drops in child mortality. We've got increases in literacy. So they'll kind of like check off a bunch of stuff, and they'll just say like the profit motive has been the responsible for research and development, technological breakthroughs. And I don't know ever really what to say to that, because I feel like on a micro level, I completely feel that there is this issue about contentment that does not get introduced into economics, which seems to be essential for inequality and these things, at least at the top end, But I was curious, like, what is your reaction to hearing someone say that, well, the profit motive is really important for addressing inequality, maybe not addressing inequality, but addressing absolute consumption by creating more.
So is this the same as, I mean, it's tricky because the profit motive has a long history. But it's not coterminous with the history of capitalism.
Yeah.
In which the profit motive is highly animated, but you've had money lending from time immemorial before capitalism as a social system existed, and that's predicated on the profit motive. You've had long distance trade where people attempt to buy something low and sell it high, and that motivated by the profit incentive. So I'm not sure. I mean, we've had the profit motive for a long time without having significant economic development. Now, if the argument is that when the profit motive operates through a system in which we have two great social classes, labor and capital, and that's been associated with a variety of forms of economic development, I think that's indisputable. But it's also been associated with a variety of negatives. So, for every expansion in GDP, we also have destruction of the environment. And so, and the entire system is predicated on a fundamental class inequality in terms of who produces the social surplus versus who appropriates it and controls its use. So
it seems like a lot of public policy that comes out of like, the neoclassical Orthodox, however you want to say, mainstream economics, 20th century. It's interesting. It's like, pollution, for instance, it's inefficient, or market power, it's inefficient. It's like, it's the efficiency normative concept, and the idea of equality equality. I don't feel like in my training, maybe we learned it and I just wasn't, paying attention. I mean, I was always barely keeping up in my classes, so there's probably a lot of stuff I just don't remember. But it feels like efficiency is the framework for addressing those problems of capitalism, but it seems like stratification economics also addresses those problems, but in a very different way. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
How would I articulate where that, that tension is between us both agreeing on something like pollution, or us both agreeing on, imperfect labor markets, monopsony? We both agree, but I'm not a stratification economist. What exactly is the difference between us?
I'm not entirely sure. So this is a reach on my part. But my thinking is that since stratification economics is predicated on the view that people are concerned about group affiliation, group identity, and the success of their group relative to others, that's the separation point in terms of the context in which we might understand monopsony power,
right,
or other circumstances, and that's what separates stratification economics from other approaches, because in stratification economics we're really trying to understand why there are significant and sustained differences in life outcomes across social groups. And so it may be that there is monopsony power in the world that's being exercised, but it's going to be exercised disproportionately by members of Group A versus Group B.
Okay. So it's not necessarily even going to be challenging or offering or like suggesting an alternative theory of the firm. It's sort of motivated by group level differences in fairly important life circumstances like mortality and persistent wealth gaps and things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, who owns the firms,
right?
And who decides what the firms do?
Okay, yeah, right. Right. Well, I don't want to lose track of this, because I really am loving us getting to know each other, or me getting to know you better. But this new book that you have with Kirsten Mullen on African American that discusses in it it's called Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. So I was curious if you could tell me a little bit about the sorts of things in this book if you could tell me a little bit about reparations and what the argument of the book is.
Yeah, the core argument of the book is that Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States never have been given the material conditions for full citizenship in this country. And that's what a program of reparations must do, is provide those kinds of resources. And to do that, we argue it would require, at minimum, elimination of the racial wealth gap by building Black assets to the same average level of assets that are held by white households or white Americans. And so that's the central point of the book. We argue
it's only going to get bigger.
Well, the longer you wait, the larger the bill gets. That's right.
Because of compounding interest, it's just going to get get really large. So do you, in the book, what are sort of the estimates of the size of the gap, and that would require these it would be transfer programs? Is that right?
Well, it depends on how you interpret transfer programs. I mean, we actually argue in the book that you could fund a reparations plan without raising taxes. So there is a redistribution that is taking place, but it would not be a redistribution necessarily via transfers of funds from one set of individuals' pockets to another set of individuals' pockets.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It's funny. Like, I didn't mean to, but I was just thinking. I've been sort of trying to figure out. Well, what are the testable, falsifiable predictions that come out of stratification economics? And I was thinking to myself after we were talking, if group identity is endogenous to that threatened position, it almost seems like reparations or elimination of wealth gaps at the personal level or the group level almost
is extremely hard to do.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm sure it's
extremely hard to do given the preferences that are associated with stratification economics. Yeah.
But I was also wondering, is it also hard to do because among people where the gap might close? So it's like amongst higher educated people or entrepreneurs or successful businessmen, then they're not threatened anymore. And the group identity could even weaken at that point where gaps start to close. Is that a possibility?
Well, it's actually not the case that gaps close at the upper end of the distribution.
Okay.
So for example, 1/4 of white households have a net worth in excess of $1 million, and it's only true for 4% of black households.
Yeah, sure.
So there really is not a convergence at the upper end. There's no convergence anywhere along the wealth distribution.
But wouldn't it be true for that 4%, like for a member of that 4%, like extremely wealthy people, like, Kanye West just passed $1 billion, and you're watching him. I mean, it's anecdotally, but his public statements seem so different from his public statements at the beginning of his career before he was wealthy. And it's almost like we don't
know if that's just because there are certain psychological problems that Kanye West personally has. But
right.
But there's another way to think about it, though, which is that the folks at the upper end of the distribution who are white are so much wealthier than everybody else that they would not be necessarily opposed to reparations.
Right.
Because their personal relative position is not going to be affected very much.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
So it may be the case that the folks who are the most well-positioned will be the more open or receptive to a reparations plan, but I'm not sure that's the case. That's just
right. Well, the marginal utility of consumption of sending spaceships into space is probably pretty small.
Elon Musk.
Yeah, right. I'm going to only be able to send out 10 spaceships this year instead of 12. Well, it's really nice to finally meet you. I've followed your work ever since I was in graduate school. I wrote on mass incarceration amongst African American men and its impact on marriage markets. And I remember reading some of your work early on, and since then I've learned more of your work, and have been really benefited from it. And I've really benefited from this conversation, thinking about these things. I'm sorry about your team. Those were 15 brutal points, right? That was or 12 or 15.
Well, they were up by 15 at the half, and they lost the lead. But I can't complain. I mean, they went farther than anybody had really anticipated. Well, I do want to say that the work that I did on marriage markets and disproportionate female headship in the Black community is work that I did in conjunction primarily with Samuel Myers Jr. and then more recently also with Terry Ann Craigie. And the other thing I'd like to mention is you asked about the cost of a reparations plan. And so based upon the 2019 survey of consumer finances, it's estimated that the average Black household has about $842,000 less in net worth than the average white household.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were to treat that as on a per person basis, it would come to approximately $350,000 as a gap between an average gap between blacks and whites in the United States. And so if you're going to directly eliminate that differential, it would cost at least $14 trillion.
Okay. It seems like, would it be, since it's a wealth gap, is it a transfer of capital more than like income? I mean, I actually haven't thought.
It depends upon how you want to make the payments, the direct payments to the eligible recipients, and you could do it with less liquid assets than a cash transfer. You could do it by setting up trust accounts, annuities, various kinds of endowments, or you could do it with a combination of those things.
Right.
But what's critical in our study is we take the position that the eligible recipients should have complete discretion over the use of the funds.
Yeah, sure. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Trusting people to decide what they do with lump sum transfers is usually has.
I mean, conventional economics says that's the best way to do it.
Right. Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you, Dr. Darity. And I hope we get to talk again in the near future.
Thank you. Thanks so much for talking with me.
Okay.
Sure.